So we're waiting for Anna to exchange the camera and laptop and whatever.
Okay.
She's coming from Gradski Detektiv, so city detective
Okay.
is the name of their podcast.
I see. Okay.
I'm coming from one called 5 cents or 5 stotinki in Bulgarian, 5 stotinki.
Okay.
And Nikki can say something maybe because
Yeah, I used to be a part of Channel 4 podcast, which
I see.
is again it was basically initiated by Alexander, by Sasha here. And yeah, there were like 10 people in it, me including, and we had like 2 seasons in which I was a part of. And I actually, funny enough, I kind of joined the podcast as a guest because I really liked talking about edgy topics. And yeah, I really got it was very funny for me and like entertaining for me to talk about stuff with other like people who are smarter than me and who've done more in their lives. And I've always liked that part of the interview and the overarching discussion that happens on the podcast medium.
Wait, so tell me, can you each of you tell me, and I don't think I got your name. Is it Alexander? Or
yes, it's Alexander.
okay, Alexander. Okay. Could you tell me about your podcast, and then Nikki, you tell me about yours?
Let's say that it's polythematic, so we're not focused on only one team, and we're doing interviews. We're two guys, hosts, and these interviews are mainly directed towards strengthening values in society. So it's a general team, and we're inviting different people, talking, having interviews, focusing on their achievements, but not like these motivational ones, which are, you can do it and so on.
Yeah.
It's like what was your way towards something, and at the end they leave these 5 cents. So this is something small that they give to the audience.
I see.
So it's interview podcast within usually 1 hour, 15 minutes long.
Got it.
Channel 4 was also, and it's also based on interviews, and Gradski Detektiv is much more similar to RadioLab.
I see. Okay. I want to hear more about that. Like what, Anna, if you don't mind.
That was such a, yeah. That's kind of humbling. Well, it is a narrative podcast, and we're trying to create stories. It's thematically, I would liken it more to perhaps 99% Invisible, because it's connected to the city and to architecture, and architecture plays a part. But basically, we're trying to discover some sort of myths which we investigate, and we try to tell a larger story from them. So I'm just going to give one example.
Yeah, please.
One of them is about a neighborhood in Sofia, which is called the Zone. It is literally called the Zone 19. It's a prefab neighborhood, kind of, with very, very tall apartment blocks. And in the 90s, it was a bit of, it's in the center. And I mean, when I say ghetto, it's of course not the same thing as what would be implied by ghetto in the States, but it was a very criminal place with bad reputation in the 90s. It was connected to a lot of drug dealing. But it was originally conceived and built in the late 80s by the communist authorities as some sort of model neighborhood. So the topic of the podcast was why did it fail? Why it failed?
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. So that's one example.
I see. Did you learn anything interesting about why it failed?
Well, it was the first sort of neighborhood which was constructed with a lot of there was a lot of underground there was an underground parking, and like it was supposed to have this you were supposed to take out your trash. I mean, it was supposed to get taken out underground, so it had a lot of underground parts, and because of this, it also didn't have any trees because it was like mostly like concrete, one large concrete slab. So it was very unwelcoming because it didn't have any trees. But also when the change came in 1989 and these services stopped functioning, this sort of underground structure became very useful for drug dealing and so on.
I see.
So yeah. But we were very surprised to learn that it was once built as, this sort of utopic neighborhood of new living, and actually artists were supposed to live there. Some artists still live there. They were given apartments there. So we interviewed a few of them, and yeah, and there were some quite scary stories from the 90s as well. So it was a good balance of something that you learn and something that's really striking.
Nikki, do you want to say anything? And do you go by Nikki? Is that okay?
Yeah, Nikki. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Yeah, the short version.
I see. Do you want to say anything about anything you're working on these days that is interesting to you, or yeah?
Well, I'm kind of not a member of the podcast now, but when I was primarily occupied with doing the Acticast rubric, which is concerned with inviting guests to speak about active citizenship and basically local communities. And the idea of this thing that I was leading in a sort of way was basically to show people in a very pragmatic way how to inspire their communities that they live around, and how to complain in a proper way, like how to complain with a purpose, so that you can achieve something out of that. How to energize the people, to not be so kind of down on themselves, and to like collectivize the things that they were not happy about.
Yeah, that's amazing. I feel like I want something like that for the US. That sounds really cool.
Yeah. By the way, just a quick question towards you.
Yeah, please.
So would you say that I used to be a very avid RadioLab podcast enjoyer. For some reason I stopped listening to it, but I think I just stopped listening to podcasts for some reason. I don't know why.
You're allowed to stop listening to RadioLab.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying. Would you even describe it as a storytelling podcast? This is the same way as Gradski Detektiv is, because I always felt that it was like news, which were very niche news, but delivered in a very astonishing English, like almost like a fairy tale kind of way. But yeah, how do you describe the podcast even?
Yeah, so I guess I would describe it as a narrative nonfiction show. So like, yeah, I think storytelling is definitely a good way to describe it. And we're also long form, like, we're typically doing episodes that are half an hour to an hour long about a given subject. I think there's a lot of different opinions within the team about how newsy the show should be, like how responsive to current events we should be. But I think overall, I think everybody on the show at this point, it started out as a very science-focused show, and in some ways still, does a lot of science. But I think at this point, we're really just following the curiosities of the people on staff. And sometimes that has to do with the news, and sometimes it's just, things from history or things from science. And so it's increasingly just become like the main thing that unites everything that comes out on the show is the storytelling, I would say.
That's interesting. Would you say that you're kind of audience captured in a way? I don't know if that applies to you, but like, do you feel that the audience kind of dictates what they want and you kind of try to appease them in a way?
Honestly, I don't think so. Like, I think that if all sort of podcasts exist on a spectrum of, some are very audience informed and, the listeners are writing in and suggesting story ideas. I think RadioLab is like kind of on the other end of the spectrum. Like, there's some episodes that we do that are informed by listener questions. So we did 2 episodes called Asking for a Friend. And that was, internally, we called it like stupid questions, because it's just like very basic questions that people have that seem stupid, but like they're they have interesting answers, or, that kind of thing. So some of those came from listeners. And we definitely do like talk about, like, listeners do pitch us, and we'll talk about listener ideas that come in, but typically we're really not responding to like listener asks for what we should cover on the show. And then the other thing is, we as a show aren't really being held accountable to like industry data on like what listeners want, which is kind of nice, like to be able to be free from that sort of market pressure, just because I think the show has built up a reputation over 20 years and has a large listener base. So I think it's been able to free itself from that kind of demand. But I guess I'll also say, like, if you guys have, I get the sense that you guys are all making things. I'm more than happy to have you guys dictate how I can be helpful to you, what questions you'd want me to answer, whether it's about like RadioLab or about anything that you're dealing with that I can help with. Yeah, just please feel free to give me whatever questions you have.
Maybe if it's possible to tell us a bit more about how you got the idea about this podcast, how you gathered the team at the beginning, and then we can just start asking questions. Because
Sure.
We gathered several podcasts around. We asked them what are their needs, and surprisingly, needs are related to money. So how do you attract supporters like Patreons or some other platform, or maybe sponsors or whatever? But this is a bit further than what type of content you create. So Nikki already said that he was listening to you. I think that the first ever podcast that I've listened was RadioLab.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, and I still remember maybe it was for some rights of prisoners or something related to prisons. It was several years ago. So I was impressed that you're looking and dealing with topics which are closely linked to what I'm doing. I mean, this society development processes, what's important, how to deal with obstacles or challenges in the society, this active citizenship in general, to know what's going on around and so on. So that's why me personally, I'm interested how you started a podcast which is, let's say, different from the main crowd of podcasts where one guy is hosting and another guy is a guest, and they are having an interview. What I'm doing, actually. So
so okay, so I guess first I'll just say a little bit about me, and that maybe will help contextualize what I'm gonna say after that, which is so I'm a producer on the show. I have been on the show for about 6 years. And just to put that in context, like RadioLab has been around for 20 years. So I definitely wasn't around at the beginning of the show. But, you know, I know basically what I've heard about it. So in terms of what my role on the show is as a producer, I'm kind of doing anything from pitching story ideas to then doing reporting and booking, you know, people for interviews, sometimes doing the interviews. And then also a big part of my job is taking all the audio from, you know, the reporting and then building it into something that sounds nice and is fun to listen to and has music and sound design, and just making draft after draft after draft of an episode. And so kind of, I would say I have a role on the team where I get to do a little bit of everything. Yeah, so that's me. In terms of what I know about RadioLab and the growth and the genesis of RadioLab, my sense is that, you know, when Jad Abumrad started the show, it started as like a 2-hour slot on the radio where he was just doing like philosophy/science stories. Like he just had time he was working at this radio station, WNYC. They gave him this slot and they were like, see what happens. Like it's a late night slot. Nobody's listening. It's whatever. And slowly it became a more like science focused and a show that's asking big philosophical questions. And I think it really became what it is when Robert Krulwich, the former co-host of RadioLab, came on board. And I think what both of them were really committed to was, okay, we want to talk about big questions, but we want to talk about it in a way that's easy to understand and like easy for people to engage with. And a big part of that is having a very conversational tone. You know, I don't think it's a coincidence that a big part of the format of RadioLab is not just like interviews with guests, but you have a reporter that is basically telling the story to the hosts. Even now we have different hosts, Lulu and Latif, but the format is the same. Like in any given episode, you have a reporter and they're just telling the story to 2 other people. And you as a listener kind of get to be a fly on the wall of that conversation. And you, like Lulu and Latif, are almost like a surrogate for you. Like all the reactions that they're having, all the questions that they're having, you as a listener are kind of having as well. And so that format of like listening to someone tell somebody else a story is, I think, a huge part of what makes RadioLab engaging, as opposed to if it was just, you know, the host saying, hello, listener, here's the story we have for you today. Like that would not have the same conversational element that I think the format that we use does. And then I think the other piece of it is like a real commitment to telling a good story. So whatever the topic is, to really try to lay out the story in the most engaging way possible. So in ways that preserves as much surprise as possible, or mystery, or like, you know, takes turns that you don't expect it to take, or has characters that you feel really attached to. Like, I think those are all things that on the team we think about a lot, and we start thinking about them when an idea is pitched. So, you know, when we're talking about story ideas, we are already asking, okay, what are the characters? What are the, you know, scenes? You know, why is this surprising to anybody? And I think that's sort of baked in. And then when we're doing the drafts and drafts and drafts, every draft is trying to get closer and closer to the most engaging way to tell that story. So I think at some point in the sort of evolution of RadioLab, it became so there was sort of a system in place to tell these really good and engaging stories. And the idea was, okay, let's take these storytelling abilities that we as a team have and apply them to things other than science. So, let's do stories about the law. Let's do stories about, prisons. Let's do stories about activism. And I personally have done a fair amount of stories about the Supreme Court. So, if we can talk about, like, if we can tell stories in an engaging way, and we can pinpoint ways to make people feel things about topics that they usually just look at the news and they're like, okay, yeah, whatever. Like, they feel very disengaged most of the time. If we can make people care about that stuff through our storytelling, then let's try to do that with different kinds of topics. And so that's sort of how the show has become what it is today, where we're covering a little bit of everything. I don't know, tell me if that's answering your question, or and maybe remind me what your other questions were.
I didn't have any other questions. That was in general. So how many people are engaged in one production of one episode?
Yeah, that's a good question. So overall, our team is very big. We have like around 20 to 25 people on the team. And the way it works is, at any given time, different people are working on different episodes. So on one particular episode, there might be 3 or 4 people working on it, sometimes 5 people working on it. And everybody's just working on different things at different times. So typically there will be a reporter. So the person that like pitched the story idea has done all the interviews. And there's also an editor. There's usually 2 editors. So there's an editor that is very closely involved in listening to and reacting to each draft. We call that a mid editor. So they're sort of in the trenches with the reporter as they're reporting, and then as they're going through drafts. And then there's a top editor who's meant to be more of like a bird's eye view kind of person. Like, they will listen to drafts like every few rounds, and they're giving, instead of giving like very minute feedback, they're giving like big picture feedback. So there's 2 editors. Then typically there's a producer as well. Sometimes the reporter is also the producer, like it's the same person, but other times the reporter and the producer are 2 different people. So the producer is the one taking the tape, cutting it, arranging it, sound designing it, and going through those drafts, as I said. So that's at least 4 people. Sometimes there's like more than one reporter. Sometimes there's more than one producer. But that's the basic unit that is working on an episode.
And how would you describe the general pipeline of making one episode, from the recording to the editing and then the publishing of it?
So I think the RadioLab timeline is a little bit unique in that because we have a big staff, it sort of creates the luxury of being able to work on episodes for a couple of months at a time. Our show comes out every week, but because, people are working on different things at different times, it gives everybody sort of a little more leeway. And we do also re-air older episodes that, people might not have heard from like years ago. So that also creates like a stream of content that we can kind of keep putting out on a weekly basis while we're working on new stuff. So yeah, typically I would say like 3 to 4 months is like is sort of the minimum that we spend on an episode. which I think for most podcasters, that's like an absurd amount of time to be able to have to work on something. And yeah, in that time where it's like the reporting is happening, the drafting and the production is happening. We're like doing more interviews or retracking things. We also do something called brain dumps, which is kind of the backbone of like a RadioLab episode, is something called a brain dump, which is exactly what I was saying before. It's the reporter gets in the studio with the host and just tells them the story in the most like natural and instinctive way possible. And for us, like, it's really important to capture that tell in its most like unpolished, just natural kind of form. And what we end up putting in the episode is like a combination of that original telling and then also, narration that we've added on or written in. So a lot of why the show sounds so conversational is because it is truly happening spontaneously. But then we're like tightening it, embellishing it, making it more clear, adding details in the production stage.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to ask, and that was whether how scripted is that conversation, for example, between the hosts and the and the report, because we've tried to do a few episodes this way. We usually work with one narrator, but we just, since we're possibly some of us, well, myself, I don't work in a radio, so we're not such radio personalities, and it just never sounds like, we can never get it to sound natural, so in the end we're like
it's really hard. I think and I do think one thing I like about RadioLab is, with the people on the show, there's no delineation of like, oh, this person's a radio personality and this person's not. It's like, it's not like a thing that you either have or don't have. It's just a thing that everyone knows how to talk as themselves. It's more of just like a learning process to figure out how to channel that when you're sitting in front of a mic. Because I think everybody's instinct is like, you're sitting in front of a mic, oh, let me sound more proper, let me not say so much, there's a lot of that. And I think the way we tackle that is in a couple of ways. So the first is the brain dump, which makes a big difference, though I think the reporter often is working from like an outline. There isn't a script per se, but like if I'm a reporter and I'm brain dumping to Lulu and Latif, I'm usually going in with like a general sense of like the order in which I'm going to tell them the story. And the thing that adds spontaneity to it is they don't have that script. They're just sort of asking questions when they naturally arise. And the conversationality of it really comes out through that, because chances are if they're having a certain question in a certain moment, most people listening are also having that. So it kind of creates a cadence for the conversation that feels very natural. So that's sort of the first way. The second way is when we're reading things that are scripted. So, we'll take the audio from the brain dump and be like, these parts were really fun. We'll keep this exchange. Oh, that question that Latif asked was really good. We'll keep that. And let's try to preserve as much of this as possible. But like the reporter misstated this fact, or we actually want them to talk about this whole other thing that they didn't even touch on in this conversation. So there are imperfections in that original conversation that we want to address with narration and tracking. So we'll script that stuff, but the way we ultimately narrate it is, even if it's written on a page, oftentimes what we'll ask people to do is like, okay, read it the way it's written in the script a couple times, like get familiar with the information that you need to get across. Because in any given sentence that they have to say, there's sort of an idea that they need to communicate. And ultimately, sometimes it doesn't really matter the exact words that they say it in, so long as they get that idea across. So it's like, say that sentence a few times, understand the idea behind it, and now just like put the paper down and say it how you would say it. And a lot of times that version comes out so much better than what was on the page, just because there's so many extra words on the page sometimes that nobody actually says. And just don't, like, people read it and they're like, this doesn't sound like me. So when you put the page away, sort of having in your head that idea that you wanted to communicate, then it comes out a lot better. So I guess even if, you know, you in your production process don't have the time to be doing like a brain dump or like, you know, dealing with all the chaos that comes from just like a spontaneous conversation, I would still recommend like trying to do that way of tracking where you just put the page aside. And you know, I think it works even with people who, we often have people on the show that haven't been on the radio before, and it tends to work especially well with those people, just to get them out of their head a little bit.
You give them something to read, or what do you mean?
Yeah, so sometimes, so not for guests, like not for like, you know, a scientist that we're interviewing about a story, but you know, sometimes we'll work with outside reporters.
All right.
So for example, you know, one person I've worked with a lot is this guy named Avir Mitra, who's, his day job is as an ER doctor, but he has a lot of interesting story ideas. And he used to be a RadioLab intern. So he's like a friend of the show, and he'll like pitch us ideas, but he doesn't himself work in radio. So when I've worked with him, you know, he'll have lines that he needs to say in the piece as the reporter. And I'll, you know, I as a producer will have scripted a few things for him, like, oh, Avir, like, you know, you in your brain dump, you didn't mention X thing. Can you say a line about that, you know? So then I'll have him do the like, okay, now put the paper down and just tell me, pretend we were sitting at a bar and you were just telling me the story. And like with people like that, I feel like that really makes a big difference.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. I just think that increasingly podcasts are, in the US at least, are moving away from the traditional like NPR like newscaster style, and there's a voice that goes with that that's very like, I don't know, official sounding, and has a sort of element of performance to it. And I just think that it's something that makes a listener experience so much more engaging. So I do think I'm glad that you're, you know, thinking about that for your show.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually ended up doing that. I mean, we tried several times, but we ended up doing exactly what you said. So last year we tried to do an episode like that, but there was like a lot of facts, and I was the absurd thing is that I'm working with my best friend, but I went to the studio and I was like, I want you to ask me questions. Then she asked me questions and I got all the facts wrong. They're super complicated. So then I had to use her questions and sort of construct my answers. And
that's exactly what we would do as well. Yeah, because that happens all the time. I mean, if you put two people in a room and tell them to have a conversation, they're going to get like 16 facts wrong over the course of the conversation in just an effort to tell a good story. And, you know, so that kind of dialing back happens for us like all the time.
What is a good story? It's a stupid question in general.
No, not at all.
But it's the most important one. I mean, everyone pretends to know what is a good story, and in the same time, it's almost always wrong.
Yeah. I mean, this is like something that within the team we debate all the time, like especially when we're considering story ideas, like what is our rubric for what a good story is? Like, how do we judge as a pitch? So I mean, I'll just tell you, I guess, some of the elements that I've learned working on the show are really important for us. I think number one is just characters. I think that a lot of times people have an instinct to tell stories as a topic. Like, let me tell you a story about education. Let me tell you a story about prisons. Let me tell you a story about, and I think one of the things that the show is committed to doing is we're not going to tell stories just about topics. Like, that topic has to come alive through a person. So there has to be somebody that is doing something, going on a journey, asking a question, trying to answer it. And that is just, I think that's just something that listeners connect to so much more than saying, here's an abstract idea that you should think about. So I think the character piece of it is really essential. And often if we get a pitch that doesn't have a character, we don't really do it. I mean, one way we sometimes do it is the reporter becomes a character, right? Like the reporter is, just by virtue of being so invested in trying to answer a question, almost becomes the person that takes you on the journey, right? So trying to think of an example of this. Like we did an episode once where a reporter on the team, it was like the pandemic had just started and people were talking about, well, why doesn't the government just print more money? And this reporter on the team was like, I'm obsessed with that question. Why can't they just print more money? And then just goes on this whole journey to find out, like, can they not? Why can't they? Why can they? You know, and she almost became the character. So even if, I guess what I'm saying is, even if you don't have somebody who's like a person who did a thing or an activist who is, you know, living through a problem, going on a journey, you yourself can kind of become a character by virtue of your own interest for a topic. So at the end of the day, listeners just need another human being to connect to. And sometimes it doesn't really matter who that is. So I guess that's number one. Number two is like a series of events. Like, I just think that, again, instead of moving through topics as like an intellectual exercise of like, here are the pros, here are the cons, here's the, you know, nuances of this topic. Instead, we'll just be like, okay, we have a character. What happens next? A lot of our stories are just driven by, okay, what happens next? And why is it interesting? And so having that narrative, I think, really gives people, I mean, there's something just so, I think it's like a need in human beings that just transcends time. Like we've been telling each other stories from like the dawn of our existence, probably. And there's something so elemental that in that of just someone saying A happened and then B happened. And then guess what? Anybody at that point is like, I don't know, tell me, you know, like what happened after that, you know? So I think that kind of narrative is super important. In that, I think surprise is something we're always thinking about. You know, what is interesting about this? What is new? What is something about this story that you may not have considered before? What's something about this that might make you feel conflicted? I think that's something that we think about a lot, is like, what are the two sides to to a given idea? Like, really, I mean, I would say that talking about things that people feel conflicted about is something this show does a lot. And really getting to the heart of like the conflict and why you might ethically feel two ways about something, or, you know, why a person is complicated or why having a certain opinion is complicated. I think tapping into that is like a big source of fuel for the show. Yeah, so I guess I would say those are the three major things, like surprise, narrative, and character, are the sort of main ingredients.
What about the comparing different points of view. I mean,
yeah,
it's like you know what you want to transmit to the audience, like a main message, or you're always comparing different points of view about this topic. These, journalistical standards where you need to always have the other opinion.
yeah.
Is it so important here, or you're just focused on the story? And
No, I mean, I think it is important just because in any given story there are multiple perspectives. Like I don't think we ever really start a story with the ultimate conclusion built in. Like it's never like, okay, I want to show people X, so I'm going to tell a story about it. It's more like, oh, here's an interesting thing, and here are the questions it raises for me. And like, let's not decide. We don't typically decide how we're going to end things from the beginning. Like usually we figure out endings like as we go along. And so the goal is not so much to like convince anybody of anything, but just to like embody as many perspectives as we can. So for example, we did this story a couple months ago that was about this really famous bike race in the US. And there is this one woman who is doing this bike race in a way that's really different from how it's been done before. And some people would call it cheating. Some people would call it just a new innovative way of thinking about this race, like this is how it should change, or it shouldn't be the way it always was. And so, one way they tackled that is they talked to this woman. You hear like why she did what she did and why she feels really strongly about it. And as a listener, you're kind of like, yeah, I get that, and then you hear, oh, the race director disqualified her. And then you're like, oh gosh, like that's terrible. Who is this terrible person that disqualified her? And then next thing you know, he's on the phone and he's telling his side of it. And then as soon as you hear his side of it, you're like, oh, okay, I understand why this is complicated. And so even just including different voices that are looking at that same story from different points of view, I think is a good way to create that and honor that like journalistic idea of like including all the perspectives. But it's not just for, we're not doing that out of a sense of duty to journalism, although maybe we should. It's more because it makes the story more interesting, to give the listener that sense of like back and forth, like, oh, I thought this at the beginning and now I think there's something else. Does anyone else
has questions?
I have
I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
You go first. I don't want to
occupy the floor here.
Sure.
Let Nikolai go first.
Okay, so I have two questions. First one is, what do you do with a story that turns out to be something like bad or like boring? You decide that it's that you should scrap it for some other story. Have there been such cases or?
Oh, so many. I mean, I would say that RadioLab scraps a lot more things than it actually makes. Like, and there's sort of an openness to kill things almost at any point in the process. Like, I think until things really only get to the drafting stage, like, and if they have like really survived that level of scrutiny. But yeah, I mean, certainly there are things that like people pitch that either don't have the right characters, or they're not asking an interesting enough question, or they're not saying anything new. Like, we kill stuff all the time.
Okay, and very quick, my second question is about the editing style. Mm-hmm. So what I really liked about RadioLab the first time I started listening to you guys was like the fast-paced editing. You guys include these, I don't even know how to call them, but it's like these unscripted tangents. For example, somebody's being interviewed and suddenly the interview stops, and then somebody from the host's goes on a tangent to further explain something, and then it goes like unseemingly back to the interview.
Yeah.
And yeah, I like how did that come up, and like all those sound effects, like these rapid dialogue edits, like how do you decide to do that? Because it's very I've never seen that in any other podcast that I listen to.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like I wasn't around at the show when that decision was made, but my sense of it is that within the show, there's a way of listening to tape that is very focused on the micro level, like emotions and surprise and interest. Like sometimes, you know, when you're listening to let's say you're listening to a 2-minute audio clip, right? And someone is saying 2 sentences. There's a way to hear that is, okay, 1 sentence, then the second sentence. Sometimes the way that people at RadioLab listen to those 2 sentences is like, this is a collection of 30 words. And like each of these words has its own intonation. And sometimes somebody says a word in a way that's really funny, or I don't know, unusual, or just interesting to the ear. And when you have a piece of audio that is cut with such small pieces of tape, you kind of get to highlight those micro moments a lot more. If that, I don't know if I'm making any sense, so stop me if I'm not. But sometimes, like, you know, we want to make the content engaging by just like highlighting that. Like, okay, in a recent episode that we did, it was about this woman, Alexandra Albakian, who created this thing called Sci-Hub. It's like an online database of academic papers, right? And she just had this way of saying no that was like really like I don't know, personable, engaging. Like she just go no, and there were, in the drafts, like I listened to a bunch of them, and we just wanted to use that no and like, I don't know, just live in the delight of that kind of as much as we could. So I don't know, I think there's something that happens when you're distilling tape down to like these micro units of sound that you just get to kind of feel it in a different way. And I do think that is where the rapid cuts and all of that comes from. Some people hate it. Like routinely people write into the show and they're like, you guys sound like you're on cocaine. Like you need to slow down. This is insane. I can't listen to this. And that's
why?
Like a valid opinion.
Appeal?
I mean, I think some people just do not want that. They just want something that is like a little bit slower. And I think for us, like we all just have really short attention spans, and like we need little things little morsels to keep us going.
The zoomer edit, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So yeah, some people just cannot stand it. And I think that's just a stylistic choice that the show has made to keep doing it.
May I just add something to Nikki's question?
Yeah.
Because the idea was, do you kill some stuff?
Mm-hmm.
If you decide to remove a topic from the list, and you have, let's say, progressed with developing it, made interviews, meetings, and so on, how do you explain to the participants that are, let's say, eager to hear themselves in the podcasts, that there will be no episode like this?
I mean, I think it's just some degree of being honest and then just sort of explaining so, you know, this has happened to me. I spent months working on something last year that ultimately the story just didn't have all the things that it needed. And we decided to kill it. And I had interviewed this one guy. I felt so bad. I'd interviewed for like hours at that point. And I had to write to him to be like, hey, listen, you know, I talked to my editors, and we keep feeling like the story, as interesting and intriguing it is, like, it hasn't been working because we can't ultimately, like, it was about a historical character, and ultimately there were just certain things about the historical character that we just didn't know. Like, there wasn't enough like documentation. There were just it was still feeling like we can't really get inside the head of this person and figure out why they're doing what they're doing. It's just too vague. So I basically explained to him a version of that, like, oh, you know, this character Julia, like, as much as we've tried, like, we just can't really figure out why her actions make sense in this way, and it's really making it hard to tell a story about her. And, you know, I've trust me, I really advocated for this story. I said this all the time. I was like, listen, I really wanted this to happen. And I'm super disappointed that it's not working out. And I'm just so grateful to you that you spent all this time talking to me. And I just wrote him this like very, very apologetic email. I don't even think it has to be that apologetic, but I felt really bad because I just taken so much of his time. And, you know, he was like, listen, I understand. Like, that's how it goes. It's totally okay. I can tell that you cared about the story a lot. And I also understand like why it didn't work out. So I don't know. I think most of the time, I don't think I've ever had someone say anything negative in response to that. Like, people just take it well, and they understand that, you know, things can't always work out. And you know, sometimes we tell them like, look, for now we're setting the story aside, but we basically just put it on a shelf. Like, sometimes there are story ideas that don't work out in a given moment, but then the world changes, or, you know, something happens that suddenly makes that story super relevant, and then we'll pick it up like years later. So, you know, an example of this is a colleague of mine had pitched a story about apologies and like public apologies, and how do these public figures that commit wrongdoings, like, how do they apologize? I forget exactly what the story was, but there was a story of somebody who had to apologize for something, and for whatever reason it didn't quite make the cut. Like, it, you know, people couldn't figure out what to do with it. And then like Me Too happened, and then all of a sudden it was like, oh, what was that story about apologies again? And it just became suddenly relevant because the world was different, or, you know, had changed in this way. So sometimes it's like, oh, you know, we're setting this aside for now, but that doesn't mean that like at some point later down the line we might revisit it.
Yeah, and they come back from the dead, don't they?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and also another thing is to tell the person in advance that maybe you don't know whether this story is going to work out or not. Or sometimes people have this vested interest in talking to you because they think that if they go on the radio, something will happen. And then, I don't know, at least I feel like I have to say that, you know, in our case, it's been like this because our show is a cultural show, and sometimes there are people who have grievances related to whatever. We had this episode about a particular house, and the woman thought that if her story gets on air, you know, because it's also aired on the national radio, and I had to stress it very much that like we're not resolving like a resolving problems show.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, I think setting that expectation from the beginning too is like super important. Like, hey, this might work out, might not, you know, we'll see. Yeah,
well, I don't know, I guess we don't have much time. I have a lot of questions. We were actually, when we started our show 5 years ago, out of nothing, we were just such huge fans of RadioLab. We were like, wow, I wonder how this is done, you know, I want to try and do something like this. And then of course it was like, wow, we started with the hardest thing possible. But I think we've been evolving over time, even though we don't have this super cool sound design. But I wanted to ask you, I know that you accept pitches, but do you work with like outside producers, or
all
like,
the time?
Do you have people like collaborate? So for example, if I thought I had a story that could be interesting,
definitely
get in touch with you.
Yeah, and I think on the show, like, one thing we're not good at is finding story ideas from outside of the United States. And that is something we're constantly relying on, outside producers, outside reporters for. And so, yeah, if any of you ever have ideas that you think might work well for the show, like, please contact me. I can put my email address in the chat.
I don't know, for example, I don't know how to pitch, let's say, Eastern Europe or the Balkans in general. I'm not sure I'm not sure what is how relevant that would be. I mean, sadly, I don't think we have a lot of time to talk about, whatever you mentioned in the beginning, that you about statistics and what people are interested in. It would be very interesting for me to hear what sort of outside stories would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think I'll say, regardless of where a story is coming from, I think if there's we're always looking for the humanity in any person's story and what's relatable about it, or what it's saying about the larger context that they're living in. So I really don't think that there's any part of the world that we would say, oh, we're not interested in that part of, I just think so long as a character is interesting, what's the journey that they've been on is interesting in some way to you, I think that there is there's something there for a pitch, and definitely would love to talk about whatever ideas you have.
Thanks.
Of course.
Awesome.
Can I ask a really basic question? Are any of you guys making things that are in English that I can listen to?
I hesitate whether to answer. So when we started 5 years ago, we were actually all the time. Actually, we've been funded by let's say endowments and grants and so on, really sort of modest programs. But when we started some years ago, we sort of pitched the idea that we're going to make it bilingual. So we're going to make the episodes in Bulgarian and then dub them in English, which I think is ridiculous for a podcast. And then we ended up not having really any money sort of to have people dub them professionally.
It's a lot, yeah.
So we have the first 6 episodes when we were figuring it out in English, but I'm not sure they're great listen as in sound, but they gave an idea of what the stories are.
Oh, great. I would love, if you have a link or something, I would love that.
I can send it to you in an email if you want.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Can you tell us maybe how do you finance this whole production process? It looks like you're a lot of people doing a lot of work, and it costs a lot of money.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I will say that I don't touch much of the finance stuff. I don't touch it at all. It's not really part of my job, but what my sense is that WNYC is making a lot of revenue through selling ads on the show. So that's one source of money. And then the other major source of revenue is just, it's a nonprofit, listener funded kind of show. So a lot of times, if you've listened to RadioLab, you'll probably hear us asking for money, because every year, this WNYC does a twice annual sort of fundraiser to raise money. One thing so over time, we're trying to move away from our dependency on ads, because with economic shifts and everything, the number of ads that we're selling changes, and that obviously has a very large economic impact. And we're also trying to move away from relying totally on listener funding, or no, we're not moving away from that, but we're moving away from the asking and doing the fundraiser and then hoping we get enough money. We're trying to create a more stable revenue by creating sort of a Patreon type thing, which is like for RadioLab, we have this thing called the Lab. That's a membership, and it's a monthly, I think, subscription, or I think maybe you can make a
$5, $10,
one-time.
$20.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you can either make a one-time donation or you pay it in installments, and it gives you access to like bonus content and like merchandise and like extra things. You get access to, I think, the entire catalog of old RadioLab episodes that are not usually available on most podcast apps. So that has become increasingly a way to bring in money that is coming in on a regular basis rather than being totally at the whims of like sponsorships and advertising and things like that. So I do see a lot of more podcasts like moving towards that model of more Patreon style rather than relying so much on ads.
Okay, what type of bonus content you publish?
Usually it's like bonus episodes, like conversations that aren't on the regular podcast feed, or behind the scenes, or sometimes it's events. Like we'll do like a Q&A with the reporter who like, you know, worked on a particular story, and like people can join on Zoom, like that kind of stuff as well. Or sometimes we do like a trivia night with listeners, like the whole RadioLab staff just gets on Zoom and we'll like play trivia with like a bunch of listeners that join the call. So it's different things like that. Yeah.
Okay. Anything else from Anna, Nikki?
Not from my end.
If you guys have more things, you can always email me.